Hi, and welcome to The Discussion with James Nash. With the legalization of marijuana becoming more prevalent in America and in other countries around the world, the question of legalizing all drugs has been a hot topic in America. Some say that drug use is an individual right, that the illegalness of drugs causes black markets and gang violence, as well as mass incarceration. Others say that drug use is not a victimless crime and therefore it should stay illegal, as well as when drugs are legal, will we see a higher prevalence of drug use by youths and by children in America? We'll discuss that and more after the break. One of the first things that people discuss when they're talking about the legalization of drugs is that it should be considered an individual right, that you should be allowed to decide what you put in your body, and the government shouldn't have any say over that. Jessica Flanagan says in her paper, Why People Should Have the Right to Self-Medicate, that legal restrictions that prevent patients from accessing the necessary means to their treatment are themselves a form of interference. What she's trying to say here is that when you're a patient in a hospital, you have every right to deny medical treatment. You have every right to say that you don't want them to inject some sort of substance into your body. So why, when your life is not at risk and you're purely doing it maybe for recreational purposes, does the government have the right to say that you're not allowed to put something into your body? And this is something that I believe to be very true. Drugs like tobacco and alcohol are completely legal, although they are incredibly dangerous. Alcohol is one of the most addictive forms of drugs and can completely ruin someone's life, but you can run to the local store and pick that up as easily as you could pick up a pack of eggs. As well as nicotine and tobacco are highly, highly addictive substances, but are readily available at any 7-Eleven or gas station that you choose to stop at. So, what makes those drugs different than cocaine or marijuana or heroin? Well, with heroin, most likely the difference is that you don't die from your first use of tobacco or alcohol. But the real difference between those is that tobacco and alcohol have been a staple in American society since we began. Prohibition showed that the Americans were not going to go without their alcohol. And so, after years of it being illegal, they re-legalized alcohol. But if it wasn't such a standard in American society, would we look at alcohol as something that should be legal? Well, if you put it under the same category as weed or cocaine, then no. It's just as, and in a lot of cases, much more dangerous than either of those drugs. But it is so readily available. Alcohol is one of the few things that we've had the ability to see go from legal to illegal to back to legal. And in David Friedman's paper, Drugs, Violence, and Economics, he points out that during Prohibition from 1920 to 1933, the homicide rate per 100,000 people doubled. Now, this is because in an illegal market, their transactions are not necessarily made legally. By the nature of the market, it's illegal. Drug-related violence happens between the drug users and the illegal sellers, and mafias and gangs need to establish themselves as the dominant place to get your illegal drugs. And this is not done by sitting around a table and discussing, but by violence. Now, the legalization of drugs would help to eliminate this violence, and we did see that. As soon as Prohibition ended in 1933, that stat dropped all the way down to about 2 points less than it was at the beginning of Prohibition. Now, the issue is that the war on drugs is somewhat a paradox. When you fight harder against drugs, then you have increased the risk that it is to be part of this illegal black market. Now, you would think that that would mean that the black market becomes less prevalent, but what it actually ends up doing is creating a more violent black market. Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy describe this very well in their article, Have We Lost the War on Drugs? They say that the paradox of the war on drugs is that the harder the government push the fight, the higher drug prices become to compensate for greater risks. Moreover, the extent of more aggressive war on drugs leads larger dealers to respond with higher levels of violence and corruption. An increase in enforcement can exasperate the cost imposed on society. In a business as lucrative as the black market for drugs, gangs, mafias, cartels aren't going to drop out purely because it's more illegal. They actually will increase their violence so that they become more prevalent and allow the smaller people to drop out or be caught by the police. This actually causes more violence and more danger to not only those using drugs or those looking to buy drugs, but those who are surrounded by these cartels and gangs. So the question of whether or not we should legalize drugs is really a question of, is legalizing drugs actually going to make things more safe? It looks like, according to Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy, that we might see an increase in safety if we can eliminate these black markets from being the violent, massacring entities that they are today. When drugs became illegal, starting in 1971 with Nixon's war on drugs, we immediately began to see an increase of people being put into prison for possessing drugs. In Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy's Have We Lost the War on Drugs, they show a statistic of that incarceration rates have grown from 33,000 in 1980 to 1.6 million today. And a huge percentage of that has to do with illegal drugs. Almost 50% of prisoners in federal prisons and 20% in state prisons are there for drug selling or drug using. This costs the American taxpayer thousands and thousands of dollars a year because these inmates have to be supported, kept alive, and fed while in prison for taking an illegal drug. Now, many who are on the side of legalizing drugs say that this is an absurd use of our resources, that just because someone sold a little bit of pot or smoked weed a couple times doesn't mean that they deserve to be in prison, and more so, doesn't mean that the American taxpayers need to pay for them to live in prison. Now, as we wrap up the argument for legalization of drugs, I'll leave you with this quote from David Friedman. To give some context for further discussion on the war on drugs, consider the following. In the United States in 2007, there were 1.8 million arrests for drug abuse violations, compared with 1.4 million DUI arrests, 1.3 assault-related arrests, 1.1 larceny theft arrests. Possession arrests account for 82% of all drug abuse arrests, with marijuana and heroin and cocaine possession making up 42.1 and 21.5% respectively of all drug arrests. That's a lot of people who have been arrested and put in jail for the use of drugs, which many argue is an individual choice. So the question of should we legalize drugs is very complicated, but we must also look at the other side, why people believe that drugs should stay legal. And we'll be investigating that after the break. So even though a lot of people say that drugs are an individual right, drugs cause violence, they cause black markets and mass incarceration when they're illegal, there is still a huge argument for why drugs should stay illegal. And one of the strongest ones is that although drug use may be an individual right, using drugs is not a victimless crime. When someone decides to take drugs, it does seem like it's a personal decision, something that only affects them. But the truth of the matter is that many argue that it's not, that it has a strong effect on not only loved ones and family, but also society that surrounds the people who decide to use these drugs. Wilson said in a 1977 paper, "Human character is formed by society. Indeed, human character is inconceivably without society, and good character is less likely in a bad society." So, what he's trying to say here is that if we were to try to legalize drugs, we would be creating a society where the message is that drug use is allowed. And is that actually a society that we want to live in? Does allowing people to do something like the use of illegal drugs create a society that's better for our children? Or is it creating a society that's actually more dangerous? And in this more dangerous society with legal drugs, lots of things come into question. What is the impact that the use of illegal drugs has on your friends and your family? Is the use of drugs linked to a disinterest in doing other things for society? And also, does the use of drugs associate with crime? Is the crime that we have seen follow drugs partially because it's illegal or just the nature of drugs on its own? And in this more violent world that would supposedly be created because of the legalization of drugs, there's also a question of, would we see an increase in the prevalence of drugs? Would more people become involved in drug use if it's not illegal? In a paper written by James Q. Wilson called Against the Legalization of Drugs, he points to England in the 1960s. In 1960s, some doctors began giving out heroin tablets, around 600,000 heroin tablets. And what we saw was a large percentage of youth begin using these drugs. The demand for them became much, much higher. When these doctors started giving away heroin tablets to people, we saw a giant increase in the amount of people who decided to use heroin. In the early 1960s, London had reported that they only had 68 known drug users. And by 1968, there were 2,000 in treatment for heroin use, and many more who refused treatment. This is a possible accurate representation of what would happen if we allowed legalized drugs. People would decide that they could take the drugs and, not knowing the full impact of a drug as strong as heroin, would become very addicted. These numbers only rose in the 1980s when there were 20,000 heroin users in London alone in 1982. So if we saw an unbelievable increase in the number of people who decided to use illegal drugs in London during the 70s and 80s, who's to say that we won't see that same increase if we try to legalize drugs in the 2000s? The impact on society from legalizing drugs might create a world that is unrecognizable to the one today, a world where drug use is readily available and accepted. But does that make it better? You can decide how you feel about that argument, but I believe that both sides have very valid points, and that we can't decide something like this without really weighing the benefits and the costs of illegal drugs. Are there too many people who are sent to prison for using and selling drugs? Are there too many people who are hurt by the violence that's caused by black markets and gangs? But does this outweigh the societal impacts of legalizing drugs? It's a discussion that will not be solved today, tomorrow, or even within the next year. But if we continue to go without discussing it, then nothing will change. And More than anything, both sides agree that something needs to change. Mass incarceration is not good for anybody. It's not good for the American taxpayers, and it's not good for those who are put into prison. But is the solution to legalize all drugs and make drug use something that's socially acceptable, a societal norm? I'm not sure, but the discussion must be had. I hope you enjoyed our podcast today, and we'll come back next time. I'm James Nash, and this has been The Discussion.